Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Having some rural internet issues this morning. I think we've got her figured out. We'll just give it a few more minutes, get everybody logged on before we get started. I hope everybody's cozy at home during this crazy blizzard. So we're at 10 o'clock and I think we should get started. Morgan, cut me off if my audio starts to cut out, but I'm going to give just a general introduction before we get going. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Your Fields, Your Results findings from the on-farm research trials across Manitoba webinar, hosted by both Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers and Manitoba Crop Alliance. Thank you to everyone who's in attendance with us right now. We normally do share the results of our on-farm trials with trial participants in an in-person event, and we do hope to get back to that next year. So the goal of these trials is to, one, work directly with producers to conduct controlled replicated trials on their own farm for their own farm. Two, to enable producers to perform similar trials independently if they prefer. Three, to help make producers more profitable through research that can provide real returns. And finally, four, to create a network and system so that producers have the capability to implement research trials on their own farm. We want to be expanding on small plot research and adding to the information that we get from those small plot studies. So between Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers and MCA, we have on-farm trials in barley, corn, sunflowers, dry beans, faba beans, peas, soybeans, and spring wheat. If you or anyone you know is interested in getting involved with any of our on-farm trials, we would be more than happy to chat with you about it and and you can contact our representative offices for more information. So before I introduce our first speaker, there are just a couple housekeeping items that everyone's likely super familiar with by now. On the bottom of your screen, you see a chat box where you can type any comments or observations during the webinar. And everyone can interact in this spot. There's also a separate question and answer box that we would like you to use to direct your questions to our presenters. We're going to get through 3 presentations this morning and then have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So I'll ask that I'll ask that our presenters wait till the end and we'll answer all questions at once. Finally, the presentations are going to be recorded and posted to both the Manitoba Pulse and Manitoba Crop Alliance websites. So with that, I think we are ready to begin. I'm going to start with Laura Schmidt, who is a production specialist with Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. With that, Laura, please take it away.
All right, good morning, everybody. Just looking for a verbal thumbs up that you can hear me okay.
You're good to go, Laura.
Awesome. Good morning. So my internet is such that I cannot share audio and camera at the same time. So here's a little picture of my face. I'm really glad to be here today to talk about results from our on-farm research program. I'm Laura, the Western agronomist for MPSG. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to cover in about 30 minutes here. I've highlighted a couple trial types I'd like to focus in on a bit more. As well, we'd like to update you on what's new with the network. First of all, we'd like to welcome a new on-farm network agronomist to MPSG. Leanne Carossel's joined our team. She grew up in Sandy Lake and recently finished her master's at the U of M. So if you see her out in your field this season, please introduce yourself and give her a warm welcome. Also new this year is a 2-page guide to conducting on-farm trials on your farm. So it walks through everything from forming a research question and selecting treatments to how to get meaningful trial results. So the on-farm network is also here to help answer those questions and aid in trial setup, data collection, and analysis. And this resource can be downloaded at our website. You can find it by Googling MPSG On-Farm Trial Guide, or if you'd like a hard copy, please feel free to reach out to us after this talk. MPSG has been running on-farm trials since 2012, and the on-farm network was created officially in 2014. So we've been at on-farm research for about 10 years now, and you can see how our program has expanded each year in this animated map showing yearly trial locations. The on-farm network is fully funded and directed by Manitoba pulse and soybean farmers, so it really is a by farmers for farmers research program. And the goal here is to test new products and practices for production in a way that's going to empower farmers to conduct straightforward and reliable research on their farms. So we've now conducted more than 400 trials across Manitoba, and this is just a breakdown of those trials by crop type. So mainly soybeans so far, but we are actively expanding into the pulses. What that looks like in terms of trial types, these are the range of questions we've kind of investigated over the last 10 years. The little numbers beside each trial type are the number of trials of each type to date. So some are one-off farmer questions, while many are building larger data sets. There's everything on here from plant establishment type questions to fertility, fungicides, biologicals, and more. One example of a larger data set is soybean seeding rates, which hit 100 trials this year. There were also a few new trial types in the pulses, so investigating pea inoculant and seeding rates, which we're going to dive into a little bit more detail. But before I get into it too much, I just want to make you aware that for the last 2 years, Megan has created these short YouTube videos summarizing the results of each trial type. So they're going to cover the agronomics of relevance to each trial and do some math to see if the economics penciled out for those that did have a significant yield response. So we had a couple new trial types that I mentioned. We also had some really interesting results in some of our dry bean trials. So those are a couple of the things you can look forward to in more detail in these videos. And they're going to be available on our website at that link and also on our YouTube channel. Alongside that, we also have an on-farm report database. So all of the reports for the 418 trials we've conducted can be found on our website. You can find it by searching MPSG OFN database. So this is a screenshot of the top of that database, and you can filter down results by the crop you're interested in, the year, trial type, or region. You can also scroll down past that filter and select by the map. So in that map, you can zoom into areas of interest. You can select trials based on their little pop-up dingle thing, and it'll pop up a kind of summary of what the trial type was, crop, treatments, as well as a link to the full report for more information. And then if you scroll past that map after filtering results, you'll find a table of those results as well. So here I've filtered by soybean double versus single inoculant trials. We've got year, region, more information into those treatments, if there was a yield difference, and then again, that link to the full report. If the yield cell is highlighted in green, that means it was a statistically significant yield difference. All of these others, though there was a difference we could report, since it's not significant, the treatment difference was effectively 0 for those trials. So let's get into this last growing season. For the 2021 season specifically, we harvested 54 trials across 4 crop types and about 16 different trial types or types of questions. So here we have a map of where those trials were by crop on top of the percent normal precipitation from May to the end of October. So I know this map is a little misleading since the majority of the rain that did come came in August, but it's really helping illustrate the main story or the main point I want to get across. which is that the main story of 2021 is going to be that moisture really drove the results or the lack thereof this season. And these are some of the broader trial types we've conducted this last year. So inoculant, seeding rates, row spacings, and more. We were still able to have some fungicide trials this year, but that number was certainly walked back a bit. I'd like to briefly cover results from each trial type with a bit more of a deeper dive into soybean row spacing, pea seeding rate, and dry bean nitrogen and tillage. So starting with soybeans, in soybean biological trials, we had 3 trials comparing ohm versus untreated and 1 comparing primacy alpha versus untreated. So we had no significant yield responses to any biological product this year. And if we compare that across the network and trials conducted to date, we've been investigating different biological products for about 3 years now and have had only 1 negative response so far. So there are a lot of products that fall into this biological category, and we are happy to accommodate more of these trial types across more years and environments. So if you're wondering if that product's going to work in your fields, let's go ahead and let's test it out. Moving on, a different type of biological treatment our soybeans rely on, we had 7 double versus single inoculant trials this year, with 1 significant yield response near Dauphin. So for these trials, double inoculant is typically an on-seed inoculant plus something in furrow, and a single inoculant is a seed-applied inoculant alone. So in more detail, at that significant site, there was no difference in nodulation between double and single inoculant treatments. Both had excellent nodulation. This rating score is out of 4 here. Yield was increased by just over 2 bushels an acre, which was enough to cover the cost of the granular inoculant and provide a profit. This year in these economics tables, in our reports, they have 2 columns. So one is for a soybean sell price of $11 to $12 a bushel, and one is trying to capture the change in prices there of a soybean sell price of $13 to $15 a bushel. So when you see these economic tables in our reports, that's why there's going to be multiple columns this year to try and capture the difference in the different price scenarios we've experienced. So across the network, we've hosted 46 double versus single inoculant trials since 2013, and we've had a significant yield response that provided a return on investment only 4% of the time. So it is important to mention here that all of these sites have had at least 2 and often 3 previous soybean crops that were well nodulated, effectively building that soil rhizobia population. So if moving to a single inoculant strategy is something you're curious in, we do have this checklist for moving to a single inoc based on field history largely. Also note that there is a criteria for no significant drought. So we've been telling folks to consider using granular or double inoculation strategy for this upcoming spring, considering that we've had some challenging conditions and a granular is a bit more resilient during a tough spring. But on the flip side of that, 2021 spring was quite dry, and it looks like in the majority of these trials, the liquid inoculant on its own performed quite well, along with the rhizobia that was built up in the soil. And that's interesting. Along the same theme, we had 3 single versus no inoculant trials last year, each with a different treatment. So one was liquid and peat versus none, one was liquid versus eco-tea versus none, and one liquid versus none. There were no nodulation nor yield differences among these treatments. Across the network so far, we've had 36 trials since 2016 comparing seed-applied inoculant to bare seed and have not had a significant yield response yet. So far, these trials have been located in South Central Manitoba, where there's quite a bit more soybean history, but we would be able to expand these into the West now if there's interest. In these fields here, the soil rhizobia populations have been built up since all of these fields have had at least a minimum of 3 previous soybean crops. And looking at the field histories for these trials, at 83% of them, soybeans had been grown within the last 2 years. So this tight history might mean we can come back on inoculant, but it could also mean we're setting ourselves up for some disease and resistant weed problems down the road. Moving into soybean row spacing, we've got small plot research on this topic, but how does that shape up at the field scale? So last year we had 4 trials, 2 comparing 7.5 to 15 inches and 2 comparing 15 to 30 inches. So for the purposes of discussing this more broadly, I'm going to refer to row widths of 7.5 to 10 inches as narrow, 15 to 20 as intermediate, and 30 inches as wide. So to help inform what's going on in these trials, we collect canopy closure measurements to see how much bare ground is being left open for weeds, and it's also a measure of how much sunlight we're capturing. So this year, plants were small and stunted, and that's really showing up in these canopy measurements. So they were low across the board, and on average, the 30-inch rows never fully closed this season. So above 85% is kind of the threshold I'm using here to define row closure, because the software can have some trouble beyond that, differentiating between shadows and ground later in the season. So just to be aware of there. Comparing that to 2020, we pretty much had rows closed by R3 or potting in many cases, and you can really see the row differences at flowering already in this blue line. So lack of row closure this year even showed up on the NDVI imagery. So here's an example where you can see the 30-inch treatments from the sky. They're the ones with these big stripes from above. Across the network, we have had 16 trials to date for row spacing. So this is a bit of a busy graph, so I'm going to walk through it a bit. We had 7 comparing narrow versus intermediate row widths, and 9 comparing intermediate 15s to a wide row of 30. Do note that seeding rate was held constant over the row widths tested. At the narrow versus intermediate, we had 3 significant yield responses, and comparing 15 inches to 30s, there have been 2 yield responses so far. This is actually a bit more of a frequent yield response than the small plot research had previously suggested. But to just summarize that a bit more from this busy graph, narrow rows provided a yield benefit over intermediates 43% of the time, improving yield by just under 2 bushels per acre. And intermediate row widths of 15 inches provided a yield benefit over 30s 22% of the time, improving yield by just over 2 bushels an acre. So we can't really quantify the economics of these trials more broadly, since how you'd achieve those changes in row spacing will really vary by farm and equipment. Soybean seeding rate. So we had 14 seeding rate trials last year, testing a range of 100,000 seeds per acre up to 215,000 seeds per acre. So there were no significant yield responses, but the general idea here is to test 3 seeding rates that vary by about 30,000 seeds an acre. So this is often the farmer's standard practice, followed by 30,000 lower and higher. So the actual rates for each trial are determined by what the farmer is most interested in. So we want to make sure that we're answering each farmer's individual question first, and then drawing larger conclusions across the data set second. And across the data set so far for soybean seeding rate, we can get kind of a sense for how often that seeding rate is making a difference for yield and our bottom line. So we see across our 100 trials in 10 years, about 80% of the time, soybean seeding rate isn't having a significant effect on yield. And when it does significantly affect yield, only 12% of the time is that yield response also economically favorable. And by that, I mean the increased seed cost was at least paid for by the increase in yield. Megan actually covered this really well in last year's webinar and in her videos, so I'm going to direct you there for a full discussion on this topic just in the interest of time. But after some careful comparisons of seeding rates, we kind of end up with these general conclusions and the understanding that somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 to 180,000 seeds per acre should be adequate to achieve full yield potential. And with the price of soybean seed, this will have a meaningful impact on your bottom line. Dropping below 150,000 seed per acre may not have shown a significant yield penalty, but it also introduces a lot of risk. The rest of our crop management just needs to be excellent in order to maximize yield potential once crop stands are dropping that like too low. So we will continue asking this question with different seeding rate comparisons as long as farmers continue to be interested, and we'll continue to see what we can learn as the data set keeps shifting and growing. And now moving into peas and some new trial types, we had 1 double versus single inoculant trial this year on a field with no pea history. So pea rhizobia is different from soybeans, and it is native to our soils. So we can actually investigate the question of inoculant on fields with or without a history of peas. At this trial, nodulation was good to excellent for both treatments, and as a result, we didn't see a yield response. Another difference between peas and soybeans to be aware of is that it's a different nodulation rating score we're using over here. So pea nodules are indeterminate, meaning they branch as they grow and they form these kind of globular structures. So rather than individually counting nodules, we do use a rating card that it's going to account for above ground growth, the number of these clusters, and where they're located on the root system. So this trial just barely fell into the less effective nodulation category. There was no difference between treatments, and that kind of reduction in nodulation is expected to have been due to the dry conditions, which were especially apparent in this field. A second inoculant trial also investigated the rates of granular inoculant, comparing a normal rate to a double rate. So there were no significant nodulation or yield differences here either. Pea seeding rate trials were new this year. So something as we noticed as we were doing plant counts and fungicide trials over the last few seasons were that pea plant stands were kind of all over the place. And this led to the question of seeding rate in peas. So this graph is showing plant stands at R3 in plants per square foot in those fungicide trials over the last 3 years. So, and we were finding that they were almost never up to the recommended plant stand from the small plot research, which is 7 to 8 plants per square foot. However, we are seeing some good yields at what would be considered low plant stands. So this raised a couple questions for us. Are we leaving yield behind? And why are these plant stands so low? So in some cases, the seeding rates were just generally lower, but across the board, we were on average only seeing about 60% of the seed put into the ground becoming a reproductive plant at R3. And that needs more investigation. So overall, these questions are really what drove our interest into pea seeding rate trials this year. And let's get into some of the information from those trials this year. So we had 4 trials that we could actually take to yield for pea seeding rate trials this year, and 5 that we have plant stand data for. So one we couldn't really get plant counts on since changing up seeding rates between passes just didn't really agree with the drill, resulted in plug lines, misses, and clumps. There were no significant yield differences in these trials. Yield was again driven by environment and moisture here, but I would like to dig into these results a little bit more because we've got research saying what we should be targeting for plant stand, and it's actually pretty rare that we're seeing that in the field. So what's going on? So looking a little bit more into how the plant stand progressed throughout the season, each of these rows is a different trial. And for each of those trials, seed was sent out for germination testing, which is the second column here. And then based on plant counts, percent survivability was calculated at vegetative growth stages, or more effectively, what made it out of the ground and emerged, as well as survivability by the R stages. So what made it to produce yield in the end? On top of what we expected to lose based on germination, we saw about 12 to 20% that didn't emerge successfully. And then as the crop progressed into R stages, on average, we saw a loss of another 4% of plants. So for example, what that looks like, we'll take a look a little bit more in depth at this pea seeding rate 04 trial near Roland. So based on the 89% germination for each seeding rate treatment down here, we'd expect to get a plant stand of the blue bars in a perfect world, if just based on germination alone. The orange bars are what actually came out of the ground during B stages, and then the gray bars are what made it to the end of the season during those reproductive plant counts. So there are pretty big gaps between what we might expect from germination and what's actually coming out of the ground. So there's lots of factors that can come into play here. There's seed handling damage, drought, seedling diseases, cutworms, you name it. But at the low seeding rate, we've also got some more mortality during the season. And this also happened in a couple of the other trials too. And again, that's a bit risky to me. So we might not have seen yield differences in these trials, but in stressful years, just how many plants can you afford to lose? Similar to those soybean seeding rate trials, the rest of your management just needs to be excellent to maximize yield potential. And also not measured here was lodging. So lower plant stands aren't going to be able to hold each other up as well come harvest time. That's important to pay attention to. So I'm really excited to keep exploring this trial type in the future as we keep digging into pea plant stands. And then to quickly wrap up peas, we had 4 fungicide trials, 3 comparing a single application of fungicide versus none, and 1 comparing a double app to a single app. So in June this year, we did get 1 or 2 good rains in some areas, but it ultimately wasn't enough to create much disease pressure, and yield wasn't influenced by a fungicide app in these trials this year. But ahead of these fungicide trials, we did use the Mycosphaerella blight fungicide decision worksheet to determine what kind of risk level there was for disease to develop. So this is a tool here that we recommend to farmers to make informed spray decisions. So we wanted to use it in these trials to inform ahead of spray timing what we thought the results might be. So quickly working through this worksheet with the 3 single versus none fungicide applications this year. So each column is a different trial. We scouted the field ahead of flowering, rating the crop canopy and its density, the humidity in the field, accounting for the 5-day forecast, and looking for those Mycosphaerella blight symptoms. So we did this at a number of spots in the field, and that's why we're coming up with these kind of funky average numbers. But at most, we were really just seeing these light lesions in the lower canopy from Mycosphaerella, just these little light freckles. So on this worksheet, a 65 is considered the trigger for a fungicide. And when we add these scores all together, we're really not at much of a risk for disease developing this year. As the forecast changes, or if you're noticing symptoms creeping up the canopy when you're scouting, that's when it's time to revisit this checklist and see if it's going to push you over the edge. And once again, this resource is available on our website. You can search it on Google using MPSG P fungicide worksheet, or if you'd like a physical laminated copy you can take into the field, feel free to reach out to us. We also had 2 faba bean fungicide trials as well, testing single versus double applications. So these are each a summary of the 2 fields and their disease ratings for Ascochyta, chocolate spot, and other blights. They were prevalent throughout the trials, which you can see from this incidence rating. It's quite high. However, it was at these really low severity levels. So an example of what that actually means from the trials at disease rating timing. So disease, while present quite commonly, it was really restricted to the lower canopy and just kind of some few lesions on the leaves. So we weren't really at much risk from disease damage here. Across the network, we have had 3 trials so far. So you are seeing most of the results here on this page already. There was quite a big yield bump last year. There was quite a bit of moisture throughout the season at that field, and it was a treated versus untreated trial. Just to round out fungicide, we also had 2 dry bean fungicide trials, 1 single versus no application and 1 single versus double app. So white mold wasn't present in either trial, and as a result, no yield differences emerged. If we compare that to previous trials, so far we actually haven't had a response to fungicide in dry beans, but if we look at the last couple of years here, 2020, 2019, the incidence in those trials has just been really low to 0 so far. But that brings us into dry beans and some trials I want to show a couple more pictures on. So for dry bean tillage trials, we had 2 trials comparing strip till to conventional till, 1 in black beans and 1 in pintos. So both were located in south central Manitoba on wheat stubble in clay soils. Tillage treatments were established the prior fall. This year, as crops transitioned from vegetative to reproductive growth, there were noticeable differences. So conventionally tilled beans were generally smaller and less vigorous compared to their strip till counterparts at both trials. And these differences persisted to maturity, where the pinto beans were so green that they actually weren't able to be harvested. And since those conventional till strips couldn't be harvested, yield was effectively 0 for those plots, making strip till the economical decision in this case. So total costs were calculated based on the fuel, labor, and operating costs for each tillage system. So you normally also wouldn't see this giant economic increase. It's really just because we couldn't harvest that conventional till treatment. So the comparison is to 0 there. At the black bean trial, on the other hand, the differences in vegetative growth between treatments was more subtle, but still a bit noticeable. So both treatments were able to be harvested, and strip till resulted in nearly a 300 pound per acre increase in yield over the conventionally tilled plots. And this is expected to be a result of moisture conservation here. Again, these black beans were also on 30-inch rows, and you can still see those strips from the NDVI again, indicating those rows never fully closed. Onto the economics, here is the cost difference based on the farmer's fertilizer, application, fuel, and operating costs. So strip till had both the yield advantage as well as the advantage of being a bit cheaper to implement here, resulting in a net increase in profit ranging anywhere from $66 an acre to $173 an acre, depending on your black bean sell price. So black bean sell price ranging from 30 cents a pound to 60 cents a pound. And then moving into nitrogen fertility, we had one end trial in pinto beans in 2021. At the later vegetative stages, there were some visual differences where the zero end check strips were a bit paler than the adjacent strips that had nitrogen applied. And these visual differences persisted through flowering, where we did see improved growth, vigor, and even advanced staging at the highest end rate here. This carried through to a significant difference in yield, where the highest rate of nitrogen, which in this case was 70 pounds per acre, increased yield by about 150 pounds per acre compared to the zero end check strips. Next question is, was that 150 pounds enough to improve profitability? So here we've got the cost of those nitrogen treatments as what prices have been like as a long-term average for urea versus what prices were like at the time of putting the report together. So we're still trying to kind of account for those differences here. Assuming those urea costs, the yield increase was profitable, even assuming a black bean sell price as low as 35 cents or 30 cents a pound. How that fits in across the network, we've had 5 dry bean nitrogen trials starting in 2019. There's also some complementary small plot research that has been ongoing at the Pulse and Soybean Agronomy Research Lab at the same time as these trials. So the first 3 sites here, we've had no significant yield response to nitrogen. And then at the 4th site, the highest N rate of 105 pounds per acre actually resulted in a decrease in yield. So the assumption there is that the rate in that year under those growing conditions just pushed vegetative growth too far and the seed didn't have time to fill. That's kind of the working theory for now. But to answer why we weren't seeing responses, this year we started taking regular soil samples of this trial type. And those soil samples have given us some insight to what went on this season. So why did the 2021 trial behave so differently? Well, it's probably going to come down to growing season conditions. So something we were starting to wonder about and actually started to indirectly track in the last season was the potential contribution of mineralized nitrogen to dry bean and nutrition throughout the season. So last year was exceptionally dry, and mineralization isn't a very prominent process under those conditions. So we saw this reflected in the samples we took throughout the season, where we have pretty stable nitrate levels in the top 12 inches. And this is the year where we also saw a yield response with N fertilizer. So we do need to track this in other seasons with different conditions to round out this theory, but it is a good example of the value that can come from asking the same question under different conditions and over multiple years. So those were the 2021 results with a bit of a peek into how they fit into the results so far across the network. Looking forward to this upcoming growing season. We do have a range of trial types we're interested in testing, and we also hope you are as well. So one trial I would like to start in peas is investigating the question of pea seed treatment. So pea survivabilities have been low. First question, will a seed treatment improve the number of plants that make it out of the ground? We also now know that we've got pea leaf weevils more commonly across Manitoba. So their populations or levels are currently low enough that we wouldn't expect a seed treatment to be an economical decision, but at what point will they be? And the other question is, does protecting pea seedlings from early season root rots and seedling diseases translate into yield at the end? So those are a couple questions on why I'd like to get that trial type started. But if there is a product or practice not on this list, or if you're interested in testing out one of these trial types on your farm, please do reach out to us. And here is our contact information. I would like to thank you for your time today. So I've been Laura, your MPSG production specialist, and here is Leanne's contact information for anyone more interested in the trials or participating. And then on the side here, we do have our links to the results database and summary videos I was talking about as well. So do feel free to reach out if there's any questions, you're looking for more information, or you want any of those resources I talked about today. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Again, if you have any questions for Laura, please type them into the question and answer box and we can get to them at the end of the webinar. So next up, we have Jordan Carpenter of Tone Ag Consulting. Jordan's going to cover some of the spring wheat and barley results from the 2021 growing season, as well as cover some longer term results. So over to you, Jordan.
Hi, good morning. I'm just about to share my screen here. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, how's we got the right screen up there? Everybody seeing what they should be seeing, I hope.
Yes, I think you're good to go.
Perfect. Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk about the wheat and barley portion of the Manitoba Crop Alliance Research on the Farm trials. Again, my name is Jordan Carpenter with Tone Ag Consulting, and let's get started. So what we're going to cover today is a brief overview of all the 2021 wheat and barley results, with a bit more of a focus on the wheat seed treatment trials that we've been running the past couple of years, and the kind of an update on the plant growth regulator trials that have been running since 2018. So for 2021, we had 36 sites across the province. Obviously, as many of you know, there was definitely some challenges to this growing season in terms of weather conditions, especially in the Interlake and central Manitoba, where yields in the cereals definitely were lacking. That's kind of an understatement, but you know, some of our sites were in that to 15 acre for spring wheat. With that being said, rainfall ranged from about 117 to 163 millimeters with an average of 145 millimeters of rain. And that runs from May to August. So in general, across our wheat and barley sites, that's about 66% of normal for cereal growing. So let's get started with the wheat seeding rate trial. So that was new for 2021. We had 6 sites in the province. Seeding rate differences had to be a minimum of 25 pounds an acre over the producer's normal check seeding rate. As you can kind of see there, it ranged from about 110 to 135 pounds per acre. Our target plant stands generally for spring wheat would be in that 25 to 30 plants per square foot. Whereas you can see there, for the most part, even our low seeding rates, we're still able to achieve close to that 25 plants per square foot range. We did have 3 of our 6 sites showed a statistical difference between plant stands. So what that kind of tells us is that, you know, we always kind of struggle with, you know, for a seeding rate trial, like what's the minimum range that needs to happen before we'll actually see a difference after emergence. As you guys know, germination, there can be some differences in germination and things like that, obviously with weather. But we did actually, I was kind of impressed to see our some of our higher seeding rates, so pushing that close to that 3 bushels an acre. We were able to see, you know, 40 plus plants per square foot, which of course our staff at Tone Ag had a lot of fun counting all those ones there. But at any rate, of those sites in terms of yield, 2 of the 6 showed a statistical difference between yields. You'll see in the low seeding rate category at a kind of a low yielding site in gray, we did see a positive yield advantage for the lower seeding rate. And same with the site in Woodlands, where their lower seeding rate in that case would have been about 90 or 95 pounds per acre, out yielded the other 2 seeding rates. So what that looks like in terms of economic analysis at those 2 sites that did have a response to the low seeding rate, they basically saved $8 an acre in seed costs, netting them about $41 more of net profit. So we're kind of excited to see what maybe a little bit more rain will do in terms of a growing season in 2022 when we continue these trials. So just a brief look at wheat fusarium head blade timing. We had 4 sites in the province this year. As most of you are aware, fusarium was not on the top of the concern for most producers, just because it was very hard to find. So as you might understand here, our late timing, early timing of fungicide versus our untreated, there was no statistical yield difference between any of the treatments at any of the sites. And when we're looking at our seed samples that we took at harvest, we had no difference. Our DON numbers were all below the detection level. Our protein numbers, of course, ranged from about 12.5% to 18%, which is definitely something that you normally see when you have a bit less moisture and a bit more nitrogen. Basically, that isn't utilized and kind of stuck in the plant there, and that gives us an average of 16.1% for protein this year. Again, no differences between any of them. So for 2021, we continued the second year of the malt barley variety trials that we're working with collaboration with CMBTC and also the end users. They'll be able to see the data like maltsters, buyers, things like that. So roughly 5% of Canadian malting barley is produced in Manitoba. About 90% or the bulk of it is in Alberta, but we definitely still, I believe it's around about 500,000 tons normally per year. We've had 7 different varieties chosen to be grown in these trials since 2020. And for more detailed information on the barley quality results that CMBTC took with the seed samples we collected at harvest, there is a really nice article in the winter edition of Focal Point. I advise everyone to take a look at that if you have any interest in malting in malt barley. So just a quick overview of our sites this year. We had 5 that were seeded. Unfortunately, we did lose 1 to drought. The farmer wasn't able to swath the strips in the same direction as the planter, or as the air seeder, I'm sorry, just because they would fall through. But at the end of the day, we were able to harvest 4 of the sites, 3 of them with normal to slightly above average yields. One of them, our Westlake Gladstone site, definitely on the lower end. But it was still nice to be able to see there was some varietal differences there for that particular farmer to see that. Only one variety, the Bow, failed to meet malting quality, so germ has to be above 95% to achieve malt. So it was 94.5. So I mean, it was close, but it just wasn't quite there. There was statistical differences between generally the Synergy and the other varieties at the other 2 sites. Synergy is kind of becoming the standard for malting barley in terms of variety selection. There was some high proteins, as you can imagine. As we talked about, spring wheat, barley was no different. Due to the drought, malting companies, especially adjunct brewers that like Anheuser-Busch that use adjuncts such as corn and rice, things like that, were able to blend in the barley pretty easily. Especially because there was such a demand for it, and the supply wasn't as bountiful as normal. So we have 1 year left on this project in partnership with CMB. And just a couple of pictures that we took of the same site, same strip. So this was our site in Wawanesa. We have AAC Connect on the left and Fraser on the right of those images. We did see a color and maturity difference throughout most of the season between those 2 varieties, but it ended up being statistically the same yield. Sometimes when we see a bit of a delay, I know in our 2020 site with Goldman, we saw a bit of a same sort of thing, like a color difference and kind of a delay. That's where we did see quite a bit of a yield penalty. But for whatever reason, it was more just visual than anything else. Okay, so focusing on a little bit more of a detailed portion of our segment here with wheat seed treatment. We'll start with that one. So Manitoba Crop Alliance has made it a priority to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of using a seed treatment on plant survival, quality, and yield of spring wheat. So to date, the 90% of the trials in our trial sites have used fungicide seed treatment only with no insecticide component. So over the past 2 years, 2 out of 17 trials, one in 2020 and one in 2021, or 11%, have shown a statistical difference in yield due to the use of a fungicide seed treatment. Plant stands have been basically the same, as you can see there, 24.6 to 24.7. So we're not seeing really any early season, root rots or things like that that have caused any reduction in the plant stands after emergence in the untreated strips. We're basically flatline on there. Also, protein, another thing that we've measured with that after harvest. Again, no statistical difference there. So basically, it is important to note that obviously the last couple of years we haven't had a lot of moisture after seeding, especially in May. If the wheat, like I said, in some of these trials this year was seeded kind of mid-April, and we didn't have much rainfall until kind of the May long weekend. So again, we're not seeing that really heavy pressure early on like we would have maybe in 2014 and 15. One of the sites that did respond, this was up near Dauphin in 2020. We did see that noticeable color difference, basically from emergence until mid-July, but no real detectable early season differences in disease levels or plant stands for that matter. The plant stands were almost identical, but we did get a yield difference of 4 bushels per acre. So in this case, unlike the barley I showed previously, this turned out to be statistically different and also yield about 4 bushels an acre. Looking at economics, out of the 2 sites that have responded to seed treatment, it's average about 2.6 bushels per acre, with the cost of that fungicide seed treatment at about $7 to $7.50 per acre based on 2 bushel seeding rate. Wheat prices, of course, definitely not where they were a few years back, but I'm using the current numbers that I've been told. We're roughly around that 11 to 13 bushels per acre mark. So we're looking at net profit of $24.20 an acre when it does increase. Okay, and switching gears to the plant growth regulator trials, MCA has made it a priority to look at plant growth regulators and their effects on height, yield, and milling quality of spring wheat and barley in Manitoba. So far, we've had 4 products used to date. As you can see below there, Easy Grow K, Manipulator 620, Modus, which is new for 2021, and Omex Liquid K Extra, which is their PGR with a little bit of potassium fertilizer. So Manipulator, or this is thanks to Belgium Canada here. This is the Manipulator Chart. I'm sure you guys have seen this over the years. It's not a new product anymore, but it's still important to kind of go through. So for our trials, we were kind of targeting that early stem elongation at growth stage 30 to 32. For most of our sites, we did have a few that decided to do a split with their herbicide and then come back in at flag leaf timing. We had a few sites that tried that out just to see if that was a better fit instead of making that separate trip across the field. But generally, your window is basically from about leaf to flag for products like Manipulator and Modus. Actually, all of them for the most part. And that's just a picture of a couple. When we were when we were out there just before we sprayed. Again, targeting that early stem elongation for the best timing. But one thing that we noticed this year, we had about 12 days to apply our plant growth regulators for our sites that we had selected. You know, make sure that temperatures don't get above 28, even in an hour or so, like after application. I mean, generally it's the same thing for most herbicides and fungicides, but just to avoid any risk of crop damage. But one thing that we did kind of look back and notice was that almost half of the days in our window, temperatures were above 30 degrees Celsius this year. So it's just something that to keep in mind if you are planning to use these products. That just make sure you follow the label and all the guidelines, and try your best to spray in when temperatures are, you know, around that 20 to 25 mark, I guess I would say. So for plant height, you know, for our treated strips, this is basically a snapshot across all the trials, about 44 sites, I believe it is. 73 centimeters on average for our treated strips, or that you've used the PGRs, and 78 centimeters for untreated. So on average, we are seeing about 4.7 centimeter height difference. And what that means is, you know, when you look overall across the 44, 45 sites, we are seeing, you know, definitely a benefit of about 53% of the time we are reducing, or had a significant height reduction use of the PGR. But when you look all across all trials, there is still a difference across when you compare all the sites. So lodging is one of those things where, you know, when you look at the labels and look at all the research that's been done on these products, like this is definitely where the strong point is, or where you should be using these products when you have, you know, high fertility combined with maybe a higher seeding rate, and also with the potential for heavy moisture, especially at head emergence and flowering. So we've only had 4 sites since 2019 that have had any significant lodging in the trial. You know, so ratings we do from 1 to 10 for severity, and are rated on a percent of course incidence level. In the 4 cases that we did see lodging, the PGR definitely reduced the incidence and severity of that lodging. It's just a picture of the our site near Crystal City in 2020, taking kind of just before harvest. So another place that we did see is kind of a snapshot of the NDVI drone imagery that we fly every year. Of course, this was done on July 17th. This was our Wawanesa site. As you can see on the left, the RGB image on the left, you can really see where the PGR was applied and where it wasn't, in terms of the reflectance from the drone, sensors. So this trial resulted in 3.5 bushel increase in yield. The main thing to take away from this is that the untreated strips can only be combined in one direction without risk of severe losses due to the lodged wheat. Well, this is a situation, yeah, 3.5. I mean, it doesn't sound like very much, but in terms of production and timing, like if you had to harvest this whole field only one direction, you guys know how long that would basically double your harvest time, right? So it's this is definitely the place where it really shone using a PGR. Place where it struggled a little bit this year, we had 2 sites that used Modus, 2 barley sites. The barley heads did not fully emerge from the boot in the treated strips, and we did see quite a significant yield decline, kind of in that 5 to 10 bushel range in both sites due to the extreme heat drought after the PGR application. So something to kind of, and this is not just in our sites. I know I heard rumors and reports from across the province. It's just something to keep in mind if weather forecasts are looking hot and dry. It might not be the best time to use Modus. I mean, it definitely shortened the barley. There's no doubt about that. But it also kept the heads from fully emerging. So for looking at yield, we had a statistical difference 7 out of 44 trials, or 16% of the time. Overall, we're only seeing about 1.5 bushels between all the sites. Again, I have to stress that relatively dry conditions combined with almost no lodging, it kind of makes sense. We're not seeing it more often, a response. In terms of quality, one thing that was a bit of a concern early on was protein levels being negatively affected. I can happily report that our treated average and untreated average is 14.2% across those sites, so no difference there. And also some milling data. So we sent a bunch of seed samples to the Canadian International Grains Institute there in 2019 and 20. They see no differences in milling yields between treatments for the Brandon, Cardale, and Fowler. We actually had an increase, I believe, with Rowan. And the treatments with PGR did not impact overall flower performance or quality, which is great for our end users. Again, there was a little bit of worry coming from their millers and bakers, for that matter, that anytime you tinker around with or potentially tinker around with something, they're always a bit concerned. So it was nice to show that there was no impact on flower production. So in terms of yield response, so the sites that did respond positively would average about 4 bushels an acre, with an average cost of a product $15, application $8 an acre, and again wheat price $12. So we're looking at a positive net return on those sites at $25. So some acknowledgements, Manitoba Crop Alliance, of course, the farmer cooperators that have, you guys have made this all this work possible. So thank you for that. AgVise Laboratories for running all our soil samples and doing all the analysis there. Belgium and Canada, Syngenta Canada for donating product over the years, and Sigi. And I believe that is it. There's our contact information there for Daryl, the research trial specialist with MCA, and then also my contact information. And then again, we'll hold questions till after Morgan is finished. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. So we are approaching 11 o'clock, but I hope that you guys will all stick with us as we welcome Morgan Cott, our agronomy extension specialist for special crops with MCA. So over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Mallory. Hope this is the correct screen.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. I usually put the wrong one up. So yeah, thanks, Mallory. I'm Morgan Cott. I'm the agronomy extension specialist for special crops with the MCA. So I'll be discussing our results for our research on the farm trials with our special crops. Our special crops trials include sunflower planting rate, which was in its first year of data collection last year. We continued with the corn planting rate trials for year 2 and 21. So I'll be reviewing both data sets for these crops. And I'll give a little wrap up with what MCA has for research on the farm trials planned in 2022. So as I said, this is our first year having the sunflower planting rate trial with the purpose of quantifying the agronomic and economic impacts of both increasing and decreasing the normal planting rate for sunflowers on any given farm. Typically, sunflower planting rates don't get played around with too often because it does include a greater risk than most crops just because of the already low planting rates. But producers are interested in knowing what the best planting rate is for their operations. So this trial is a needed one and has given us pretty interesting results for the first year. Decreasing the planting rates can increase the sunflower head size due to lower competition, but that might not be a good thing depending on plant stock strength. Alternatively, increasing planting rates will likely decrease head size, and we need to know that fine line of reaching the right balance between population and greatest achievable yield. This trial helps us determine what the ideal planting space is for the given variety, and also it's important to work to do this work when environment isn't ideal so that we learn what planting rates work in what kind of conditions. Trial setup is very simple and is the same in both our corn and sunflower planting rates. planting rate trials. Every grower has the planting rate that works for them on, or that they regularly use. So we take that specific rate to the grower and then take a planting rate about 3,000 ppA higher and 3,000 ppA lower, or plants per acre lower. These will be the 3 planting rates that we choose, or that the producer has chosen. And if the producer is interested in pushing a little bit more, they can do that, and they have done that in these trials. But most do vary by plus or minus 3,000 plants per acre planting rate. The setup on this slide was designed for an oilseed producer, and you can see how the planting rates are randomized on the side image here. And the planting rate for convex will be lower than this, as they normally are for populations. Here we're looking at the results for year 1 of the oilseed trials. We had 6 sites in 2021. You can see the RM here that each site was in, the producer's check planting rate in the 3rd column. And next you can see the final plant stand measured at V2. We do have the 1 site location this season that did yield some statistically significant data from both plant stand and yield. The RM of Stuart Burns site, you can see the 2 higher planting rates were very similar, but higher than the low rate. Also notice how much lower the plant stand is than the planting rate. The check rate was 25,000 plants per acre here, and they achieved 19,750 plants per acre. So yield was the highest in the check rate, but not by much over the high planting rate. And there was a significant yield increase over the low planting rate. One more thing to note for each trial is that row spacing does vary across all of the sites. In our sunflower trials, we have 4 sites that were on 20-inch centers, 1 that was on 22, and 3 that were on 30-inch centers for all the 8 sunflower trials. We had the 6 oils here and 2 more convex trials. So let's look at this trial site in a little bit more depth. This is the data that we've taken away just from the RMF Stuart Burns site, which was the 1 site that yielded those statistically significant differences. All these individual site data sets are available on our website, so you can look at each page as is right on our website to have a better look. But so just to run through the data that we have here, the site was near pansy, previous crop was soybeans on a coarse loam, planted May 1st. Fertility was 70-0-0-72. Row spacing was 30 inches. You can see the 3 planting rates that this producer chose. October 20th was a harvest date. And so in this table here, you can see the planting rates, 22, 25, 28, and the plants per acre, the actual plant stand count at V2. Then below we have the quality data. Dockage was minimal, moisture was very consistent, 1,000 kernel weight was consistent, and then the sizing was fairly consistent. Oops. And then here we just have the same chart that you're going to be looking at in the graph here. The 22,000 plants per acre yield about 2,500 pounds, and so on. And also interesting data for this year, of course, was a rainfall. This site was at, I think, about 76% of normal rainfall. A summary on each trial: significant difference in yield of 3,000 plus pounds per acre between the 25 and 28,000 seeds per acre versus the 22,000. There was a significant difference in plant stands between the 3 planting rates. There was also some seed that blew and was stranded at the soil surface. So that's the reason that you're going to be seeing these big drops in actual plant stand in comparison to the planting rate. Now we have a look at the 2 convectionary sunflower sites. Notice the lower initial planting rates in the 3rd column here that are conducive to convex fields. Both sites did have statistically significant differences in plant stands between the 3 different planting rates, but just the 1 site had yields that were statistically significant. So let's have a closer look here. This field was also planted on soybean stubble, planted on May 14th, has really good fertility. Row spacing was on 22 inches. You can see his 3 planting rates. and harvest date. So the 3 planting dates got decently close with their actual plant stand, a little bit better than the other trial, but still we would be hoping for better, but dry conditions obviously didn't allow that very well this year. Rainfall, I think at this site was approximately 82% of normal. And then we have some good quality data here. So generally speaking, this check rate at 16,500 plants per acre yielded the biggest seeds, grain. Here we're looking at the first oilseed site that had statistically significant data at the RMF Stewart-Burn site. We're seeing the cost per acre of the seed, then the yields in pounds per acre beside. Next, we will see the actual net profit per acre. And in the red, you can see that the check planting rate of 25,000 plants per acre achieved the highest return. Remember that this site had lower plant stands than the planting rate because of poor planting conditions and loss of seed. We don't have too many conclusions to draw from this trial in 2021. The reason being it was very dry, so it looked like decreasing plant populations would improve the soil water utilization, of course. But it's really hard to know what that perfect balance is between environment and appropriate planting rate to achieve the most economical return. At the bottom of the slide here, you'll see where you can find the individual site data for sunflower trials from 2021 on the MCA website. Moving on to our grain corn planting rate trials, these have the same purpose at the end of the day to quantify agronomic and economic impacts of both reducing and increasing their planting rates. Grain corn producers do play around with planting rates more often than sunflower producers will. We know that hybrids respond differently to plant populations and genetically work better or are built better for specific populations. They'll have their best performance in certain spacing between plants, which is also defined by row spacing. And of course, the optimum planting rates change with environmental conditions. Trial setup is the exact same as in sunflower populations. We just have higher planting rates here. The producer chooses the check rate and then decides on the high and low planting rates from here. And each trial is different because each producer and operation is different. Also, we have several row spacing in all these trials as well. We range from 10 inches, there's 10, 20, 22, and 30-inch spacings. This is an overview of all 12 sites that we had in 21. You're not going to see any red here because there was no sites that had statistically significant set of data of any kind. So that was fun for us. Just choosing one site randomly here. This one was in the arm of Broken Head near Beausejour. Also on soybean stubble. Planted May 3rd, good fertility, 20-inch row spacing. Here are his planting rates. We have the soil properties. And then you can see how his planting rates stood up to the final plant stand. So he planted 29,032 and 35, and he did pretty good for planting populations or final stands. Rainfall was poor. A lot of it fell in the later part of the year. And he had about 66, I think, % of normal was his rainfall. So no significant difference in yield or plant stands and V2 between the 3 planting populations, and rainfall was well below normal. So this trial was in its second year of data in 2021. I wanted to show the difference in the 2 years of data. The site locations and cooperators are not the same and will not necessarily be the same next year either. 2020 data is at the top table here. There were only 4 sites that got significant data, and even if you look closely at this data, the yields don't vary a whole lot at each site. And this data is all also available on our website for both years, and you can find the link below. Conclusions drawn from the corn planting rate data are identical to sunflowers. 2021 was extremely dry. We just didn't see the yields react to planting rates. Decreasing planting rates does improve soil water utilization, but it's hard to know what that perfect balance is between environment and population. Finally, just a quick review of MCA's plans for research on the farm trials in 2022. We're continuing 7 trials on from 2021 and prior, and also adding 3 new trials this spring, which will be the spring wheat enhanced efficiency fertilizer, barley seeding rates, and also flax seeding rates. So looking at this, if you have any interest in participating in one or more of these trials for 2022, please contact Jordan at Toneg. He'll be happy to have volunteers get in touch with him about these trials. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Morgan. So I don't see any unanswered questions in the chat or in the question and answer box. But at this point, if anybody has any questions for Laura or Jordan or Morgan, please type them in and we can answer them. There was a few for Laura that she answered right in the Q&A box. But also, if we're good to end the webinar here, then that's totally fine too. If you guys have any questions, please reach out to myself or Morgan or Jordan or Laura individually, and we can chat offline. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.